Last Sunday, in his Urbi et Orbi Easter address, Pope Francis prayed for the Indigenous people of Canada, whom he met earlier this month, to apologize for the Church's role in the running of residential schools. He then appealed to God on behalf of the Church when he prayed these words: "Let us ask the risen Lord to accompany the journey of reconciliation that the Catholic Church in Canada is making with the Indigenous peoples. May the Spirit of the risen Christ heal the wounds of the past and dispose hearts to seek truth and fraternity." The Pope's prayers tie beautifully into today's Gospel reading from St. John. Jesus appears to his disciples who have locked themselves away from the world. And it's significant that he appears to them in a body that is resurrected, but still wounded. His resurrected, but still wounded body reminds us that some wounds are for keeps. The wound itself may heal, but often the mark of the wound, especially the deepest ones, remain. There are hurts and horrors and traumas that no amount of prayer and piety can erase. In today's gospel, we see that some wounds remain, that resurrection doesn't omit or forget the past. Resurrection doesn't immediately heal the wounds, rather, it brings our sin into focus and asks us to engage with it and with the wounded person or people, because it's here that healing can finally happen. This is what happens in the post-resurrection accounts with Jesus in his meeting with Thomas in our gospel today, and then with Peter around a fire on the shore of Galilee, and eventually with Paul on the road to Damascus, and in so many other encounters, some recorded in Scripture and some not, as John tells us. I believe this is the call given to the Oblate community in Canada today, to engage deeply, where invited, with Indigenous individuals and communities who bear still the wounds of residential schools. In our Oblate apology, given by the Oblate leadership of Canada in 1991 at the Lac St. Anne pilgrimage, we read these words: "We apologize for the existence of the schools themselves, recognizing that the biggest abuse was not what happened in the schools, but that the schools themselves happened, that the primal bond inherent within families was violated as a matter of policy." As a matter of policy. It's important for me, as an oblate, as a leader, to come to terms with the fact that the colonial and assimilative beliefs and convictions behind the creation and expansion of residential schools were not the government's alone. They were ours too. We oblates and other church groups that ran the schools often characterize our historic presence in residential schools as a moderating presence, even a benign one. But we were part of the colonial system. We believed in it. The gospel today and our oblate apology compel us to wrestle with this and to engage with the still visible wounds carried by our Indigenous brothers and sisters in their communities, and to come to terms with how this has wounded us too. And so for me, this is why today we need to continue to listen to their stories. We need to touch the wounds that these stories communicate. As church, and more specifically as oblates, our calling in this moment is to engage with the wounds that our oblate presence brought Indigenous peoples and communities over too many decades. We need to listen deeply, without judgment or defense, without giving in to the urge to tell our stories in response. Father Ron Rollheiser often says that a large part of Christianity's enduring appeal is that it takes flesh seriously. Its willingness to embrace real bodies, real pain. After all, it's with our bodies that we experience deep trauma, deep fear, and eventually, hopefully, reconciliation and deep joy. John's story doesn't specifically say it, but I imagine that Thomas and earlier the other disciples did reach out and touch Jesus' wounds. And I imagine that Jesus winced with pain at that touch. But that pain, that openness, signals engagement and real presence. This is what we're called to also. In recent months, I felt privileged to be welcomed into a number of conversations with members of Indigenous communities, with leaders and elders, with survivors and families of survivors. The stories they tell of their pain and trauma resulting from time spent at residential schools, or their stories of the effects of intergenerational trauma, are always painful to hear. But it's in these stories, in the telling and in the hearing of them, where truth and healing and reconciliation are incarnated. And the resurrected, still wounded Jesus shows us the way. If Jesus himself didn't fear the bloody and the broken, then perhaps those of us who profess to walk in his footsteps needn't fear them so much either. Thank you.